Okay, plug in your iPod earbuds. It's time for another Gold Nugget with today's special guest, James Turk, founder of Gold Money and author of The Coming Collapse of the Dollar. It's a pleasure to welcome James Turk back to the show to discuss precious metals and related market trends. He's founder of Gold Money and co-author of The Collapse of the Dollar and How to Profit from It. Welcome back, James.
Thank you, Chris.
I'd like to begin our discussion, if we could, with your latest article titled, "They Are Printing Too Much Money." You say the reason that gold and silver have been on fire as of late is very simple. Banks out there are printing too much money.
Yeah, that's basically really what it is. The central banks are printing and printing and printing, and they're doing this by buying government debt. They buy that debt and essentially turn it into currency, and these actions debase the dollar in the United States and the euro in Europe. In Europe, what they're doing is they're buying Greek sovereign debt, Portuguese sovereign debt, and then turning this into currency. That's weakening the balance sheet of the European Central Bank. Similarly, in the United States, the Fed is clearly on this path toward quantitative easing again, given their announcement at the FOMC meeting on Tuesday. And these quantitative easing, it's really a fancy name for money printing. And the more money you print, ultimately you're debasing the currency. But here's the key point, Chris. What's happening is that all of this money that's been printed, not just recently, but over the past couple of years, and used for bailouts and used for stimulus, it's really done nothing to get economic activity going. And all of this money is now sloshing around looking for a safe home, a safe haven, and it's ending up in the commodity markets. And just like what occurred back in the 1970s, when those commodity markets start moving, it's a precursor of inflation coming down the pipeline. And that's exactly what's happening here. All these dollars and euros and everything else are going into safety, tangible assets, and commodities, not just the precious metals, but commodities across the board are responding and moving a lot higher.
There's been several interesting announcements this week. One, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I believe, announced we're officially out of a recession. Well, people aren't buying it, and as you alluded to, the mechanism seems to be broken here, the fail-safes that the governments were using and the central bankers. There was a report I just read this morning, I believe it was from the IMF, who claims there will be considerable social unrest, was the term they used, similar to Greece and other parts of Europe, due to the fact that jobs just aren't coming back as they had in recessions in the past 50 years.
Yeah, that's really sort of worrying, and at least the authorities recognize what's going on, but unfortunately they're not doing anything to turn monetary policy in the right direction. Back in the Great Depression, people were more self-reliant. More people, were dependent on farming, and less people were interdependent on one another living in cities than is presently the case. So if we do get increase in unemployment, and the trends aren't good because the economic activity is still bad. Who knows what the social repercussions could be this time around? It all comes back to we have to prepare for an uncertain future, and we do that in a number of different ways. But basically, you have to take those steps that enable you to sleep well at night in order to prepare come what may.
You pointed out the CRB Commodities Index. You mentioned that in the article, and you talked about it earlier here. We seem to get a base in the CRB right around the time that silver broke out of its nearly year-long consolidation. Do you expect big things ahead for silver?
I expect big things ahead for both the precious metals and generally all commodities. Because, again, there's just too much money printing, and the dollars have to go find a safe home. The euros have to find a safe home. So people are going to exit paper and keep on bidding up commodities just like they did back in the early 1970s. There's another parallel to the 70s, Chris, which I think is important. Mark Twain says that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. Circumstances are often the same, but, they're slightly different. Well, back in the early 1970s, the Soviet Union had a failed crop, and they imposed a grain embargo, and after that, the commodity markets really started going much higher, and that was the precursor of the 1970s inflation. Well, just a couple months ago, the Russians had a very bad grain crop this summer because of severe droughts, and they put on a grain embargo, and the commodity markets again are starting to move pretty much across the board in terms of higher prices. We're seeing, if not record highs, multi-year highs in a variety of different commodities, not just the foodstuffs and the grains. If you just sort of look at it from a big picture point of view, and you sort of assume that, well, when the Soviet Union made their announcement in the early 70s, we had another 5 or 8 years of inflation. And if you sort of assume again here that we're going to have more years of inflation, whether it's 5 years or not, I don't know. But the point I'm making is that commodities are still relatively cheap, and the money printing is still going on. The more money printing that we get, the higher commodity prices are going to go.
I think you made a great point with Samuel Clemens' quote, and if I could add George Santayana, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And it really seems as though we are repeating it right now. But I would guess, though, you'd expect a different twist. As you say, it might rhyme this time. Do you think things could actually rival the 70s in intensity here?
Yeah, in fact, I think it could be worse because when all of the problems started developing, back in the 1970s, you had safe haven currencies to escape to. You could go to the Deutschmark, you could go to the Swiss franc, but you don't have those alternatives anymore. The Deutschmark doesn't even exist, and the people who are running the Swiss National Bank are trying to keep the Swiss franc on parity with the euro. So if the euro gets weak and debased, then the Swiss franc's going to go, along with it. So as a consequence, the only really safe haven you have for currency and money today is, gold and silver. And as the inflationary pressures continue to build from all of this money printing, which seems nonstop, you got to assume that you're going to see higher precious metal prices, higher commodity prices, and much more inflation, regardless what the government CPI might be telling you.